It's an opportunity for me, actually, also to thank Susan and Karen for the first volume. My first article, actually, I wrote on what I actually called rape. I didn't use the word sexual violence. I'm more careful now. In 1990, it was published in Classical Quarterly, and I was just looking at the narrow question of a passage in Lysias 1, which is often excerpted and used and kind of held up as the kind of typical attitude towards sexual violence and seduction. I showed that this actually is a passage which one cannot take out of context and is actually very misleading and probably wrong. And then I must say, after I published that article, I then read the volume, the Reg Antiquity, which was published, and I found it very, very stimulating, and it caused me really to rethink my views. Not so much as that I would change my mind about the basic point, but I just realized that what I need to talk about, I need to talk about context, and this is a larger question, and one could not just simply look at these penalties on their own without considering the entire society, questions of status, and also other questions, I say, of consent. And that was a great stimulus, and then I wrote a review of the volume, and I also wrote an endorsement on the dust jacket of the paperback edition, which again showed my, this was a really valuable thing. And I must say, I think I would slightly change that comment about a non-existent topic. Non-existent from what we would call emic point of view, but definitely a topic which exists from an etic point of view. And my main point is, I think this is are we talking about really one topic, or are we talking about several topics which are related? And I think that's really important. Secondly, this really inspired me to write an article in 2004, which I kind of gave the cheeky title, Did Rape Exist in Classical Athens? But then I explained what I meant, which was not what certain people might assume actually from the title, which is the point that Susan brought up again today. Even though we use the word rape, there are many legal definitions which I gave in that article. I was glad to see the other paper, actually your paper, came up with the definition. It's very important to actually say, when we're talking about this concept, what do we mean by it? How is it defined? And this is extremely important because I realized that the definition of rape has changed a lot. In New York law, as of 1971, rape of a husband of a wife was not rape. And that is actually, fortunately, it's changed. And so our ideas about rape have been changing, which has been very important because that means we have to take a look at this topic again. And it's good to see, in a way, though unfortunately what this means is that our own ideas evolve. It means the distance between the present and the past also gets greater, which means we also actually need to have conferences like this. But at any rate, the paper that I published, it was 2004, actually came out in 2005, I really talked about the general context and how actually there were different attitudes towards sexual violence. But I must say in that paper, I took more or less the point of view of approaching it from the view of the sources of the men. In other words, that sexual violence was evaluated whether it was an offense against the woman, the man's honor, and the honor of the male relatives. But then, I must say, I caused to rethink it again. And actually, Susan, the second time I was here, Susan had another conference in 2009 in which I gave a paper actually on women's consent, which I said and argued in the 2005 paper that it actually was not that important. And then actually looking at the sources, I started coming on a number of sources which I realized I said, no, actually, female consent is recognized in the sources. And the article was published, I must say it was a long process, as Susan remembers, but it finally was published about a year or two ago on women's consent. And what was also very helpful for me was that a student of mine, Corinna Brunet-Kernan, who unfortunately cannot be here today, she had a paper, but she's been ill. She's had health issues for many years. I supervised a thesis of hers, and I had looked at a few passages in tragedy where there was actually questions of sexual violence, either threatened or it actually had taken place. And she actually came up with a huge amount of evidence. There's a surprising amount of cases of women depicted in tragedy, either the victims or possibly being threatened. But the other thing that Corinna really brought out very well in the thesis is that female consent is very important in tragedy, and it's not only that, is that the tragic playwrights also create a great deal of sympathy toward actually the victims. And this, of course, gets into larger issues of the audience, which has also, I think, come up with our questions kind of also in vase painting. The question is, when we're looking at something, we can't just look at it on its own. We have to figure out who it was actually produced for. So at any rate, today I'm actually going to, in the rest of this, I want to also come to two depictions of sexual violence, which I've given you, which are really kind of remarkable, and I want to think about them. And I also want to come back to Susan's really valuable question at the beginning. The one thing, there were only 2 essays in the original volume about painting and about the visual arts. And the one thing is that's really stunning is there's a huge amount of evidence out there. It comes in different media, and we need to think about it. But Susan's question was really excellent. When we see this, and are we being invited to sympathize with the women and their suffering, or is this purely an aesthetic approach, or to a certain extent does this kind of normalize it? I'm not sure I have an answer to this question, and I'd really like to, when looking at these pictures, I really want to ask you how do you react, and how can we imagine the different audiences? Not only would men have reacted in the same way as women, or would they have reacted differently? I'm not sure I quite have the answer, but I just want to put some pictures kind of in front of you. Okay, good. That's a long preface, and at any rate, I'm very happy to have this opportunity because my views about this have actually evolved over the last 27 years, and I'm sure actually after reading the papers in this conference, they will continue to evolve. Now, if one were to select a few passages from Greek literature and legal texts, one might get the impression that a woman's consent was not all that important in Greek society. Most striking is the contract of marriage in Athenian law. From New Comedy, we learn that marriage agreement was made between 2 men. The father, or other male relative, said to the man who took his daughter to wed, "I give you this woman for the purpose of genesioi children." The amount of the dowry was also set by a decision of the 2 men. And in the best study of Greek marriage, of Vérilhac and Vial, a work that really needs to be translated into English, she says Greek marriage was never an act by which 2 spouses were joined to one another. There are 3 people in it. There's a man, there's the father or male relative, there's the husband, and the woman is transferred. She's actually passive. What's interesting is that such an approach to marriage still exists in the law applying to Muslims in Sri Lanka. According to The Economist of 17 June this year, the law does not require the bride's consent and does not specify a minimum age for marriage. Parents therefore have the right to arrange marriages for their daughters without consulting them. So we say these are attitudes of distant antiquity. They still exist in certain parts of the world today. One might get a similar impression from a section of the law about just homicide. Now, one category of just homicide, if someone caught a person on top of his wife, sister, mother, daughter, or concubine kept for the purpose of free children and killed that person, he could not be convicted of murder and was considered ritually pure. That is, the killing did not create pollution. Now, in a passage from Against Eratosthenes, the speaker claims that this only applied to those actually seducing women, but as actually I know it's generally recognized, it covers both cases of sexual violence and cases of seduction. But here it would seem to be that the consent of the woman didn't make much difference. But on the other hand, there's more evidence from Athens. There's also a law that a woman who was caught with a moichoi, that is a seducer, the word shouldn't be translated as adulterer, was banned from public sacrifices and could not adorn herself in public. Implicit in this law is a distinction between a woman who allowed herself to be seduced and one who was the victim of sexual violence. Even though the passage from Lysias misrepresents the law, the speaker still makes it clear that there's a real difference between cases of seduction and cases of sexual violence. One should also bear in mind that in Athenian law it was possible for a wife to initiate a divorce, though she and her relatives had to go before the archon to register the fact that she had left her husband. And also we hear of marriages dissolved in antiquity by mutual consent. Not a lot of evidence for it, but it does exist. Now, some scholars have claimed that the consent of free women was of little or no importance, but Alan Summerstein has shown that this is certainly not true in Attic tragedy. For instance, in Euripides' Hippolytus, Phaedra thinks that it makes all the difference in the world whether or not people believe that Hippolytus used force against her. And she says so in the note. What's also interesting, on the other hand, there's no reason to follow Summerstein's view that stories about sexual violence followed by marriage in New Comedy were actually invented by the victim to preserve her reputation. As I pointed out in the review of Rape in Antiquity 20 years ago, the practice of having the victim marry the assailant as a way of, quote, solving the crime was actually common in many Latin American countries 20 years ago and was also approved by law. And it also is very interesting, recently in Turkey, a similar measure was proposed by the government, but fortunately it was resisted and withdrawn. Unfortunately, there's no reason, I think, to believe these are just kind of made-up stories. This is probably a reflection of actual practices. Now, as the evidence reveals, sexual violence against a free woman was considered a crime in certain circumstances and could be punished with great severity. But was the offense considered to be a crime against the woman or her male relatives? Did the Greeks, especially Greek men, feel any sympathy for a woman who was forced against her will to have sexual relations? Now here, I'm just going to briefly look at three passages. These are the ones, actually, I've given you on the handout. Since I'm the only thing between you and lunch, so I can't take too much time. So at any rate, I just ask you to kind of look at these passages, which is interesting because especially the second passage and the third passage, I did not look at, but in my own work. But what's interesting is here we have a woman who is the victim of hubris. She doesn't seem to have any male relatives. The emphasis is on the offense against her. The assailant is put to death in an Athenian court. Secondly, we have this story about Odysseus and one of his men getting drunk and violating a woman, and he is actually stoned to death by the local inhabitants. And the last one is actually a story about the Messenian Wars, probably reflects attitudes, therefore, in the Hellenistic period when it was done. But the interesting thing is here, again, we have sexual violence, and the woman is avenged not just by her family in these last two examples, it's by the entire community. So this entire community actually shows, even though they're not married to the woman, they still show a great deal of sympathy with her, and they feel it. So it's so serious, actually, that they put the man to death. So it's not just a matter of the family protecting their honor. Now, I briefly was going to talk about Attic tragedy. I'm going to cut that short. Unfortunately, again, Corinna was not here. But in her thesis, I think, she also goes and draws attention to several passages. I'm just going to talk about two quickly. They're on the second side of the sheet. And we have a great deal of sympathy, for instance, expressed in Aeschylus's Prometheus Down. When Io tells her story to the chorus, the women, actually it's the women, show a great deal of sympathy, again, for what she's threatened with. And also in Euripides' Ion, which Eric is going to be talking about either later today or tomorrow morning, also the chorus expresses a great deal of sympathy for her suffering, which is actually described. She actually says it's a friend of hers who has suffered, but not only also the chorus, who is women, sympathize with it, and Ion himself actually says it's really awful for gods to act this way. Now, what I'd like to do in the rest of my paper is look at a set of wall paintings, one found in the tombs of Vergina in Macedonia, and much more briefly a mosaic from Pella, to show how these works of art create sympathy for the victim in much the same way as the tragic poets do. The poem, now I'm going to let's look first at the Vergina painting. Does everybody have that in front of them? Okay?
What's it look like?
This is the Vergina painting is this one. Okay? Everybody got it? Now, there's also a detail. The second one is the detail of the Vergina painting. It's from the very right side. The tomb in which the paintings were found, actually, was excavated by Manolis and Andronicus between 1977 and 1979. In 1994, Andronicus published his findings in the study of the tomb in Vergina II, the tomb of Persephone. 3 of the interior walls of the tomb were decorated with wall paintings, while a 4th was left undecorated. On the south wall, there are 3 female figures. On the east wall, there is 1 female figure who is convincingly being identified as Demeter. We'll come back to that. It's the painting on the north wall that interests us. I have given you a reproduction of the entire painting on this wall and a reproduction of the section at the right end. At the extreme left appears to be a thunderbolt emerging from the sky. The first figure is easily identified as Hermes because he holds a caduceus. His left foot is far forward, his right foot is thrust back almost horizontal to the ground. As Andronicus observes, both his feet are above the ground. He appears actually to be flying. His speed is emphasized by his chlamys, which is fastened at the neck and billows out behind him as the wind fills it. His head is turned back over his shoulder, and he looks toward the charioteer. He grasps the reins of the horse and directs them forward. His pose and gestures pull the chariot forward and create a strong sense of forward movement, which counters the resistance of the female figure. The four horses of the quadriga are not as well preserved, and it's difficult to make out their bodies. 7 of the forelegs are visible, and 3 are raised very high, adding to the impression of strength and speed, drawing the man and the woman away toward the left of the painting. The 2 figures on the chariot have been convincingly identified as Hades and Persephone. Hades is mounting the chariot, his left leg stands on the board of the chariot, and his right leg is barely touching the ground behind the chariot. His right arm stretches forward and grasps the reins of the scepter. With his left arm, he firmly holds Persephone. His fingers and palm are under Persephone's left breast. His head leans forward, and his eyes are fixed on the horses in front of him. As Andronicus observes, the ruffled curls of the hair on the temple suggest the impulsive movement toward the viewer's left. To convey the sense of movement and speed, the folds of his animation are blown backwards and emphasize the strong forward movement of the chariot. The details of the painting stress the violence and the strength of Hades' movements. There's no question Hades has used much force to keep Persephone on the chariot. Now, just as Hermes, the horses, and Hades all move to the left, the body of Persephone leans in the opposite direction to express her resistance. Her body is almost horizontal, and the head faces toward the right away from Hades. Her head is behind the shoulder of Hades, but her left leg is on the board of the chariot. There's a strong contrast between the vertical stance of Hades and the almost horizontal position of Persephone, which further brings out the clash of intentions. In scenes of mutual desire in Greek art, the woman and the man face each other or both stand and sit in complementary poses, which express shared feelings. As in many abduction scenes in Greek art, and we had it actually from Robin's paper, the 2 earlier papers this morning, she clearly indicates her lack of consent with her upraised arm in a gesture of fear, and this gesture goes back to the archaic period. Her hair is disheveled and is blown to the right as the chariot moves swiftly to the left. The upper part of her body is naked, which reveals her vulnerability. Her entire body strains to break free of Hades' arm, but the force of his grasp and the strength of the horses overwhelm her efforts to escape. All the details of the painting emphasize her lack of consent, her vulnerability, and her sheer terror at what's happening to her. Even though the figures of Hermes and the horses attached to the chariot and Hades take up much of the space, the painter has added a female figure at the right edge of the painting, which balances the figure of Hermes, who is in front of the chariot. In contrast to the figure of Hermes, who strides confidently and forcefully in front of the horses, pulling them to the left, the female figure crouches on the ground in fear. She faces up toward Persephone, kneels on her left knee, and raises her right arm, bent at the elbow in a gesture of fear. She's also naked to the waist, and her garment billows out. The pupils of her eyes are painted with red brushstrokes and convey her sheer terror at the abduction. Now, Andronicus does not think she is Chione, but is more likely to be one of the Oceanids with whom Persephone was gathering flowers. What is important is that the painter has added a female figure on one side of the painting who serves a similar function to the women in the chorus who express sympathy for Io or for Creusa in Euripides' Ion. The female figure views the action from a woman's perspective and expresses horror at the abduction. Her reaction serves to create more sympathy for the suffering of Persephone and guide the viewer's emotional response to the scene. The abduction is not treated as the theft of male property. It's depicted as a traumatic event for the female victim, an event that stirs the empathy of a female view who shares the emotional reaction. Now, again, I want to go briefly to the Pella mosaic. The figures on the Pella, as far as dates go also, just quickly, the Vergina depends on the dating of the tomb, but everybody would say late 4th century. Possibly if Philip II is buried there, or Philip Aridaeus, we're in the late 4th century. The Pella mosaic is dated to 300. There's also a difference. The Pella mosaic is from a house. The Pella mosaic is this is the black and white. Yeah, good, thanks. The black and white, and the detail of it is the next to last one. Okay, good, thanks. Thanks for letting me know. We all, as it were, on the same page. Okay, good. What's interesting, compositionally, there are some very interesting features. The names of the four figures on the Pella mosaic. In the charioteer, his name is Phorbas, who's looking forward to toward the other three figures. He is restraining the four horses and waiting for Theseus, who is pulling Helen toward the chariot. Unfortunately, this part of the mosaic is heavily damaged, but we can see Helen struggling to escape with her arms outstretched to the right and her legs off the ground. At the right edge of the mosaic, we find a female figure named Deianira, who looks toward Helen in horror, but then moves away from Theseus as if fearing for her own safety. Unlike the female figure in the Vergina painting, who cowers in fear, Deianira is standing and appears to be fleeing the scene. She is also naked from the waist up, and the folds of her clothing convey her agitated movement. From an aesthetic point of view, the figure of Deianira balances the figure of Phorbas on the chariot in the total composition, but her reaction clearly guides the viewer to sympathize with Helen's terror as the female figure at the right hand of the Vergina painting. But the crouching figure at the right of the north wall of the Vergina painting is not the only figure who views the action from a woman's perspective. On the east wall, there's a female figure seated on a stone. Unfortunately, I don't have a reproduction of that. It's very faded. The colors have gone, but we can see the outline of the sketch. There's damage to her left eye and cheek, but she's completely covered in a hymation, in contrast to the female figures on the north wall. Her hand is under her chin, and her lips are pursed in a way that expresses sorrow and deep thought. Andronicus has convincingly identified her as Demeter because she appears to be linked to the painting on the north wall, and because the rock on which she sits has been identified as the mirthless stone, which we know from other sources Demeter sat on, actually, after Persephone was abducted. Not only that, in other sources. On the south wall, there are three seated female figures whom Andronicus has identified as the three fates on the basis of two passages from Pausanias. I'm not going to go into that. These figures are very faded. The problem is we don't have any iconographic kind of details which would secure the identification. Now, the thing is, again, to end, the painting from Vergina and the mosaic from Pella therefore show interesting parallels with Attic tragedy. First, there is much emphasis on the victim's reaction to the abduction. Just as Creusa in the Ion and Io in the Prometheus Bound express their lack of consent and their emotional pain, Persephone in the painting from Vergina and Helen from the mosaic are portrayed in poses that stress their lack of consent and their terror. Just as Aeschylus has the chorus of Oceanids share Io's fear and terror, and Euripides has the chorus of, oh good, I think I'm going to make it. Good. Just as Aeschylus has the chorus of Oceanids share Io's fear and terror, and the Euripides has the chorus of women voice their sympathy for Creusa, the artists who created the painting at Vergina and the mosaic at Pella added female figures who guide the audience's reaction to the abduction of Persephone and Helen. I'd also just, actually by contrast, the very last picture, which is the one of the recently discovered tomb at Amphipolis, which has been dated by most people around 300. There's some debate about who is actually buried there. There is one dissenting view of Olga Pelagia who thinks it's Roman, but I think most people would say. What's interesting here is the absence of the female figure. And I pose this as a question to everyone in the audience. Does the absence of the female figure have an effect on our emotional response to the picture, and the addition of the female figure in the other two also have an effect on our emotional reaction? So I just show that by way of contrast. But at any rate, on the other hand, to sum up, one must also bear in mind that the audiences who viewed the painting and the mosaic would have known the outcome of these narratives. Persephone became the queen of the underworld and was allowed to rejoin her mother Demeter for part of the year. There are different versions of Theseus' abduction of Helen. In one version, her brothers Castor and Pollux actually come from Sparta to rescue her. In another, she gives birth to Iphigenia. But in the end, I think we're left with a great paradox. As one hand, artists and poets can depict the suffering endured by a victim of sexual violence with great sympathy. But on the other hand, men and gods who commit sexual violence in certain circumstances, not in all, we can see that sexual violence is punished harshly in certain circumstances. In other words, where their intention is not to commit hubris, but either to marry the woman, in the case of mortals, or to give them remarkable offspring, in the case of gods, they're treated very leniently and not punished at all. But that is only a paradox for a modern audience, which has different attitudes towards all forms of sexual violence, which laws in most countries now punish as rape with severe penalties. But the ancient Greeks had very different attitudes toward these matters. Thank you very much.